And then Ashley, I guess if you want to start, feel free to start.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Corey, and for the few of us that are here at early on a Saturday morning, which I feel like makes us really real champions. So I'm actually really excited to talk about this topic. It's something I've been thinking about for a while. And I guess, oh, I'm sorry. Is there a way, I guess, Corey or Rachel, to enable screen sharing? I just have some slides I was hoping to show.
I've just made you a co-host, so hopefully you should be able to share your screen, but if there's still an issue.
Okay. Great. Okay, it looks like that's working. Awesome. Okay, so hopefully y'all can see that. So all right, so by the way, I'm Ashley Anderson. I'm in the line chair at the Air Force Academy. I'm in one of those lucky positions where I'm not actually getting a paycheck from the DoD, so I'm sort of get to say what I want to say as me. Anyway, I wanted to start today with these two quotes. So I'll kind of give you a second to just take a look at them. And so the reason that I have these up is because I think that if you are like me, right, they might strike you as surprising, because I think at least in contemporary American discourse, sorry, Corey, right, that it's really shocking to sort of hear or to see, right, this notion that that we might not owe any kind of a special duty to our veterans. And I've been really interested in this for a while. As an attorney and as a sort of law student intern, I did a lot of work advocating on behalf of some individual veteran clients and veterans organizations representing more marginalized veterans. And in the course of that, I'd often make use of these arguments, appealing to what I sort of took for granted in the my listeners, that they did share, right, this notion that we do have some kind of special or important duty to take care of veterans. And it worked, admittedly, as an attorney, right, for my clients, but in my more reflective moments, right, I'd often wonder, like, what is behind that, right? Can we make sense of that? If we have a duty, where does it come from and who does it apply to? And in doing some more reading and digging in and talking to people about this, it's, sort of either get the sense that it's taken for granted or it's just so obvious, it's surprising to question it. Or, right, coming up with theories that I thought could only really account for duties to sort of subclasses of veterans. So, for example, wounded or injured combat veterans, or veterans who had been marginalized or suffered under, homophobic, sexist, racist, or other abusive policies. But I sort of wanted to think about a sort of broader class of veterans. And so, sort of long story short there, that's what I've tried to do here, is to sort of articulate a theory that could kind of account sort of minimally for or lay out, right, a case for why we might have a duty to a sort of broader class of veterans. And so, kind of overall, my argument as it stands right now in this project, in this kind of getting exceedingly long paper, is that there are two, well, at least one, but two potential sources of structural injustice that affect soldiers, which give rise to moral obligations after war. And I call those to structural arrogation and structural exploitation. And of course, I'm going to dig into what I mean by those later. But so my overall argument is that because of the existence of these injustices, we should be thinking in sort of how we're considering our duties in a post-bellum phase about incorporating principles that are designed to restore dignity to a sort of broader class of veterans. Okay, so just so I am clear on some background terms, I know a lot of people might not be super familiar with sort of this, military ethics, just war theory kind of realm. When I use the term soldier, I might go interchangeably between soldier and combatants, but I'm generally referring to all combatants. If you are familiar with just war or international law, generally I'm referring to what we would consider lawful or privileged combatants. This usually means something like your uniformed members of, a state's or would-be state's armed forces, could be sailors and, airmen and the like, but I use that as a shorthand. When I'm talking about war here, I'm talking about international armed conflict, in the sense that we might consider that for purposes of the Geneva Conventions and international law. And therefore, when I'm talking about veterans for this paper, this project, I'm talking about soldiers, combatants who've served in these times of international armed conflict. So recognize upfront, I'm cutting out a huge swath of people that do fight in different types of armed conflicts, in different types of organizations. But I just was trying to kind of narrow here, and hopefully maybe down the road it'll be something that I'm able to spend more time thinking about. I will refer to international law, generally international humanitarian law or law of armed conflict, international human rights law, international treaties, all the sort of usual sources there. For those of you who aren't, super up to speed on just war theory, I'll just clarify. I might use the terms jus ad bellum, in bello, post bellum. Those generally refer to how we're thinking about war in phases. And so jus ad bellum tends to refer to these criteria for thinking about the morality and legality of going to war, jus in bello referring to the morality and or legality of conducting that war, and post bellum, the morality and or legality of the concluding the war and the sort of immediate aftermath. I'll also sort of make use of this notion of the moral equality of soldiers or of combatants that comes from traditional conventional just war theory. And according to this, the idea is that we ought to treat soldiers on both sides of a conflict as moral equals, in the sense that, if you have a soldier fighting on behalf of a country who's got an actually illegal or unjust cause for going to war, from an ad bellum perspective, it's illegal, that we treat them sort of as a moral equal of somebody who might be fighting on behalf of a country that actually has a just cause. It also sort of is reflected in this idea that combatants on both sides are equally sort of liable to be killed or injured by other combatants, and so long as that's done in a particular way, according to the in bello principles, nobody's committing a crime, nobody's a victim of a crime, and so everybody sort of has this equal right to kill or injure each other and be killed or injured. Okay, so just those are sort of some quick background terms. Okay, so I referenced this idea that or this concept I'm calling structural arrogation. So I just want to get clear on what I mean here. So when I'm using that term, structural, I'm referring to, properties of our institutional, political, legal systems, right? Sort of using it in the same sense that, much the same way that it's understood in our contemporary discourse about structural injustices like structural racism. Arrogation might be a bit of a more obscure or archaic term. So arrogation tends to refer to, claiming or seizing something or exercising a power without the right or entitlement to do so. So in legal opinions and sometimes in political discourse, arrogation might be used to refer to an entity exercising a power it's not authorized or entitled to do. So if we say, the American president is going to unilaterally declare war, we might say, well, then that president is arrogating, right? That power that should belong to Congress per our Constitution. Okay, so for purposes of my project, I'm using structural arrogation to refer to a social political system's exercise of power or assertion of claims without adequate legal or moral entitlement or legitimacy. So ultimately, the sort of heart of this claim that I'm making here is that sort of at a minimum, I think, international law is structurally arrogating soldiers' rights by arrogating their right to full legal personhood. Okay, so legal personhood also might be somewhat unfamiliar of a term. And so this, there's a lot of literature on this, is really interesting, but legal personhood is as sort of a right that's been incorporated into international human rights law. So if you look at the Universal Declaration on Human Rights or various human rights treaties, right, they'll include this provision that we all have this foundational right to recognition as a person before the law. And when the drafters of the UDHR were looking at it, they almost thought that it was so obvious and foundational that it might not even need to be sort of explicitly included, right? But it did make its way in there. And so there are a lot of sort of theories on what this actually means. I'll just sort of, not dig in too deeply on where I'm taking this from, but I think it means in general, right, that we, as adult human beings, at least, I'm going to, restrict it to that right now, we're seen as bearers of foundational legal rights. This means we're, I think, seen as having the capacity to, for example, be victims of crimes, right, to suffer legal harms, to enter contracts, and to be criminally liable. And that when our rights are violated, that we as a human being, we have the right to go to court, right, and to stand up in there in court and be recognized and enforce our own rights. Okay, so what do I mean by arrogating legal personhood? Well, that's when our legal or political system effectively denies sort of some of these elements of what it takes to be considered a legal person, right? And so what I'm arguing is that international law in the way that it currently exists, right, it's an arrogation of soldiers' rights because it's an illegitimate waiver of elements of their legal personhood. And you might be thinking, well, sure, we waive elements of legal personhood for people all the time, right? And so I'm not saying all of that is illegitimate. I think when we legitimately waive these elements, it's usually as the result of a legal process that is individualized to the person. So for example, you might be thinking, well, okay, if my great aunt has dementia and it's appropriate that we consider her as not having the capacity to enter into contracts, and maybe we're going to have a guardianship hearing that establishes, right, that she doesn't have this particular capacity, and we're going to put somebody else, give somebody else that sort of in her stead. Obviously this sorts of issues could be up a lot if you've been focusing on the sort of Free Britney movement for a while, right? But so some of that, right, might be legitimate. What I argue is that it's illegitimate when this waiver, this sort of waiver of these elements exists for a class of people, right, without this individualized determination as to their particular capacities, right? So some examples of arrogation of legal personhood would be English coverture laws. So if you're not familiar, sort of, these in England were laws that meant that a married woman, right, was sort of no longer conceived of actually as an independent legal person. She didn't have the right to go to court and sue in her own name, right? She could not enter into contracts. She couldn't hold property, right? All of that sort of got subsumed under her, effectively under her husband's legal person, right? Or in American institutionalized slavery, where certain elements of legal personhood were denied, right? Slaves were not considered sufferers of legal harms or victims sort of in their own names, right? Even though they might have been still considered having the capacity to be criminals, right? So that's what I mean by that. So what do I mean when I'm saying that soldiers' full legal personhood is structurally arrogated by our system? Well, part of it is that, right, by incorporating elements of the moral equality of soldiers into law and the way that we understand what, the sort of legal status of soldiers, that's arrogating their full legal personhood. And how is it doing it? Well, I think in a few ways, right, these are at least sort of minimal in my argument, right, sort of baseline. It's waiving their capacities to be considered victims and sufferers of legal harms, at least, right, in, or of course, cabin that, right, insofar as the person harming them is doing it within the, confines of invaluable principles, right? But if they're killed in a particular way, right, they're not considered a victim. They can't go sue for legal harm, etc. It's also waiving their capacity to be considered criminally liable. Now, I think, right, there are a lot of counter arguments here one could raise, right? And I deal with these in the paper, and I don't want to get, for purposes of time, too much into them, right? But they rely on things like ideas like we might have non-criminal killings, like why is this a problem? It may be self-defense, or we understand different ways of that, or maybe this is fair because we can assume that soldiers aren't in a position to know the legality or morality of the wars that they're fighting in, etc. Now, I'll just sort of tell you now, I think for many of the reasons articulated by revisionist just fourth years, or people who attack this idea of the moral equality of soldiers, I don't think the counter arguments are actually effective. I think they're well, I'll just say that. So I don't think they work, but I think effectively what we're doing is we say we say, look, there are inconsistencies in this concept of the moral equality of soldiers and how we conceive of them. But we're willing to accept those in international law for a variety of good reasons, right? Having to do maybe with practical reasons or fairness reasons, et cetera. And I'm not taking issues with those. I'm just making the point that I think when we do that, right, it inevitably results in this issue for soldiers. Now, I think in general, my main point is that this kind of arrogation is actually a harm to the soldiers' dignity. And you might be thinking like it's sort of strange, maybe in some cases, to consider it a harm. Like we might think, oh man, you get to go out there and get to kill and injure other people with impunity, like, woo, what a boon, right? But I do think it is a harm to this sense of being considered a full human being in the eyes of the law, of the international and national sort of political communities. Okay, so I'm going to get into sort of at the end how I think this plays into remedies and the like. But I think in general, this structural arrogation, it's a property of the sort of international law and legal system that we continue to support. Okay, so then the sort of second concept I'm talking about is structural exploitation. And I argue that I think there are many instances in which something like the harm to dignity of arrogation ends up being a structurally exploitative relationship, right? And so when I talk about exploitation, I'm using Ruth Sample's account where she's going to articulate that it's an interaction or a transaction or a relationship between parties in which one of them is either taking advantage of or benefiting from the degradation of another. And that degradation is failing to treat a person with an appropriate regard for their value. Now, obviously, we could go for days on what it is to treat a person with an appropriate regard for their value. I'm, cheating, sort of taking a shortcut here, right? And I'm saying, well, in a huge sense, we've already articulated what it is to treat a person with an appropriate regard for their value. Insofar as we've said, right, everybody has, right, this super foundational right to be seen as a legal person. So if we're not doing that, right, to somebody in an individualized way, we're not taking appropriate, or we're not treating them with an appropriate regard, right? Now, when it comes to degradation and also exploitation, I think it can be either intentional and instrumental, as in, I'm intending to degrade this person to achieve my purpose, but it can also be more of an outcome, right? A sort of a property of either, a structure or just a particular rule. So by way of sort of analogy or example, I think about employment discrimination law, if you're familiar with that, in which we might say, we recognize claims of discrimination based on sort of an intentional disparate treatment claim, where we say, my employer, right, they intentionally sort of did this, they treated me as or a particular group in a disparate way. We also recognize claims for disparate impact, right, where we say, right, they might have had sort of a facially neutral policy or rule, but the outcome is, right, it was discriminatory. And I think the same thing can apply for degradation and exploitation, so we can see how exploitation can be structural. I think also exploitation doesn't necessarily need to make one person or one party worse than it would have been, right? So it can be a property of, potentially mutually beneficial transactions if, right, one of the parties is taking advantage of or benefiting still from that degradation of the other. So it doesn't have to be coercive. Okay, so how is this applying? When is this applying when I'm talking about soldiers? What I'm arguing is oftentimes, not all the time, right, but a state's or a community's non-combatants, it's civilians, they often stand in a structurally exploited relationship to their own soldiers. What do I mean by that claim, right? Well, I think, look, the sort of core of it is, I think, what we're doing with just war theory and sort of its incorporation into international law is, we're aiming to reduce the suffering of war by, in a sense, cabining the violence of it, right? Cabining this realm in which, we allow force and violence to decide issues to a subset of people, to soldiers, and for those soldiers, right, we waive particular rights. And so what effectively we're doing is we're maintaining the rights of non-combatants to all of these things, right, by waiving the rights of soldiers, right? If we didn't waive those rights, I'd be probably equally likely, right, to be killed, to be seen as a sort of legitimate target, right, as we've sort of seen, in the past, right? And so what my argument is that, at least potentially, right, the non-combatants benefit from this sort of structural erogation or structural degradation of their soldiers. I argue that it exists where, look, in fact, there is a de facto benefit to non-combatants. So what I mean here is, if there's a war and let's say the non-combatants actually, they're intentionally targeted. Let's say that the forces that are attacking actually take no mind of this entire theory, et cetera, right? Or the legal system sort of fails to account for their rights, et cetera. Well, then the relationship doesn't exist. They actually, we show that maybe they didn't receive any kind of benefit. But if you have a situation in which maybe it's some kind of a military dictatorship, or the military is in fact abusing its own people, right? There we might say this doesn't exist. But in general, right, in the absence of those, right, I think it's going to exist. Now, in the paper, right, I kind of go through how I think this principle might apply to different contexts. So looking at, for example, right, does this matter whether we have conscripted, drafted military or volunteer forces, other particular contexts like those? I don't want to dive into all this because I know I'll be running out of time here soon, but I'll just say, sort of for shorthand, I think those might make differences in degrees of just how exploitative certain situations might be. But in general, I think as a minimum, I take it that, like, where this benefit exists and the like, that at least at a minimum there is this structurally exploitative relationship. So having sort of articulated those two kinds of injustices, right, I'm thinking about, okay, so what, if anything, are the injuries or harms here, and then what should we be thinking about as remedies, as a sort of obligations, right? And so I think, as I've already mentioned, right, there's a sense in which they violate rights and they degrade dignity of veterans class-wide. And I think this applies even in cases where, as many veterans might say, I don't feel degraded, right? But I think nevertheless, right, I think that's that is what's going on here, right? And so if we're thinking about use post-bellum, thinking about that, phase of creating a just end to war and a just aftermath of war, right, as goals, we tend to be thinking about, right, vindicating rights that were, violated or waived or suspended or whatever during warfare, right? And so we're also thinking about, right, how to like secure better for the future those rights. So I think ordinarily, if we're thinking about fixing these sort of structural problems, right, we might go to, well, let's look to the source, let's alter the law maybe so that it doesn't derogate, right, or so that it, this relationship doesn't exist. And I'm not arguing necessarily, I'm not arguing in this paper to do that, right? I think there might be good reasons to avoid going to opening up the potential for criminal liability and criminal prosecution anyway for particular soldiers or the ability to sue for harms, etc. So assuming anyway, right, that the current system remains in place in much the same way as it is, right, I think the sort of universal remedy, right, is just these principles designed to restore rights, to vindicate rights, right, to restore dignity. So what does that mean, right? Well, sorry, I'll talk about that on the next slide. So, and then I think when it comes to internally thinking about a political community, a state, right, then, right, we're talking about exploitative relationships, we might be looking more at these ideas of restitution and compensation, right? So just quickly to get into my conclusion here. So I think that the post-film obligations might look universally, meaning externally as an international community, right, and internally, right, we should be thinking about post-war encouraging, recognizing veterans again as bearers of fundamental rights and duties, right? And this might look like encouraging legal avenues to be heard, to seek redress for things, especially, right, for harms that might have happened to them, maybe even as a result of their own military, right? So this, I think, gets us to thinking about encouraging military justice and veteran justice type of reforms in legal systems, right? And I think it also aligns with this notion that we have of the post-film phase in which we want to encourage accountability for war crimes, right? I think it might be even sort of further degrading, right, to legal personhood to not hold these, to not hold veterans, prior soldiers accountable for actual in-bellow war crimes as well. So internally, right, where we have these exploitative relationships, right, I think we might be thinking in terms of a little bit more of sort of restitution or compensation, or kind of conferring back the benefit of that relationship. And this might look like something like ensuring a baseline of what's considered to be a kind of dignified life in that community. So this might undergird, right, this idea that we could have obligations to ensure baseline minimal levels of healthcare, housing, education, especially in societies like the United States, where these are not already minimally provided by the political community. And I think another sort of really, I want to argue another really important thing to think about is just recognition of the nature of that exploitative relationship, right? So if we think about people, we might, if you're familiar with sort of the legal system, right, there are instances in which people might just say, what do I want from a judge, or what do I want here? Sometimes it's just, I want a declaratory judgment. I want them to declare, yes, this thing happened. I recognize, right, this injustice. And so this might look like, if you've, sent your combatants, your soldiers into illegal or unjust wars, right, something like maybe potentially public apologies, right, or, right, expressions of gratitude, because I think, right, sometimes expressions of gratitude are recognizing, hey, I got a benefit from you, and maybe that benefit wasn't particularly just. So I know I'm over the time I wanted to go with, and I apologize for speaking quickly to do it, but I really am super grateful to all of you for being here so early, and I really look forward to your thoughts and questions and ideas as I continue to work on this. So thanks for your service and being here so early.
Thank you so much for the talk, Ashley. It was really good. The silent clap. So now we can take questions. until 10:35, so maybe one or two questions so that we can give time to Gregory for his presentation. So if you want to raise, or if you have a question, you just use the raise hand feature on the Zoom. So Leonard.
Great. Thanks so much for your talk, Ashley. I really liked it. I think this is a great topic. Just a quick sort of request for clarification. The postbellum remedies, are they meant to apply equally to both just and unjust combatants, or does one's status as a just or unjust combatant have some kind of role in determining what sort of remedies should be available?
Yeah, thanks for that, Leonard. I think it's that's something I've been thinking a lot about as I'm kind of working through the end of it. And my sense is that it sort of at the sort of baseline level that it doesn't make actually much of a difference. And so there might be I guess I should say, so there might be sort of degrees in which, or particular contexts, right, in which I think it is going to make a big difference. But I think insofar as the system sort of continues to sort of in the thinking about criminal and moral liability up to now, insofar as it sort of stays that way, sort of incorporating what I think it does, this moral equality of soldiers, that it's not going to, in this sort of remedial phase, actually play in as much as I think I don't know, I sort of had a sense in initially kind of coming to it that it would. So I'm sorry, I know that's not, particularly clear or specific answer, but I think that's where I'm ending up at the moment.
It's helpful. Thank you.
Jen?
Thanks. Hey, good morning, Ashley.
Hey, Jen.
So I as well really appreciated this talk. I think this is really awesome to think about and just fantastic. So the question I had was sort of, you started out, right, with this sort of thing that should strike us as strange, right? Sort of some of these folks who've been like, look, there's no special obligations, but everybody thinks there are. And I really appreciated how you worked through that. But what I'm interested in is that the grounding, right, for the special obligations that you gave was sort of the way in which international law sort of waives legal personhood, right? But so then I'm wondering how that then translates to domestic obligations to military professionals, right, to sort of respond to that arrogation of legal personhood, right? Because there seems like there's a levels issue here. So I was wondering if you could just talk me through that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that's another issue that I think is a really important one. And I think part of it is I think that the sort of obligation to be thinking about how do we fix this, it applies because it applies sort of universally in the sense that, like, as an international community, we all accept this. So in some sense, right, I mean, we could say it's kind of toothless, right, but everybody is sort of accepting the system as it is. So, insofar as, the United States, for example, continues to well, insofar as in general accepts the system of international law or something, right? So then, right, it is also sort of part of this collective responsibility. Now, we might say, well, you're in some senses, right? We might say, well, we're kind of powerless to change that, right? But then that might get us to thinking about, well, like, okay, on the back end, then, how do we want to try to remedy this domestically for our own people? And that's where I think, and maybe I need to, I think this is a good question. So maybe, to think more about how do we feel the pull of that obligation in what I want to argue for, like thinking about better legal avenues domestically. And, one thing I've been thinking about, and, this is probably going a little down the rabbit hole, but, how this interacts with things like, if you're familiar with the Ferris Doctrine, right, which is sort of a Supreme Court created doctrine, where we've said, well, we're not going to allow for military service members to sue their own military for injuries that happen to them as a result of or at all, right, sort of connected with their military service, right? And so I think part of it might be, well, like, let's take a look at whether that might be increasing this kind of harm, or we might have as we do, I think, right, a pretty not responsive system, right, where we say, well, veterans can pursue sort of some legal avenues, right, but they aren't provided sort of a good opportunity to be heard. And then I think what I was trying to do with sort of talking about when that sort of structure, the international legal structure, the system becomes exploitative, was to say, well, it's in those circumstances when we should be feeling that obligation even more so, not necessarily that we feel entirely the responsibility of creating the international legal structure, but that, well, we can at least see it's in place, and whether I intended to or not, I as a civilian benefited from this, at least, de jure in theory, right? Does that make sense? Sorry. Okay.
And then Zach, and then we should move on to Gregory's presentation.
All right, thank you for that. That was a really interesting presentation. I love the approach in thinking about dignity and how legal personhood and rights are figuring into this. I have a question about your sort of reparative solution. So one of the things you said is, in the United States, for example, where we don't have things like healthcare for everyone and whatnot, one of the things we can do is sort of elevate the return the dignity of people by giving housing, medical care, etc. At least, I mean, this is laying my cards on the table. I want to ground those things in just social obligations we already have. And so if we were doing all that to start with, if we just got the good thing right to begin with, then I still think we're going to have a problem that you're raising here. And so then I wonder, well, what then? Does that mean all we have left are public apologies and expressions of gratitude? And then I wonder if those get into problems with nationalistic rhetoric or something like that, that it may ruin our ability to respond with gratitude sometimes in a genuine, expressive way. Or do we need to go the other direction and just say, no, once we have like our basic rights accounted for, that at least that I want to say are already socially obligated, do we just need to go backwards and say we need to fix this from the start? There's no further thing we could do. I'm just curious what you would, I guess, say to that.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great, and so I think I agree in the sense. Well, let me see here. So, my preference too would be, right, we see these as sort of a universal obligation, right? And we have some system of, socialized healthcare, et cetera. We have these sort of baseline minimums. And in those cases, I think you're right. The obligation is not going to be as much, right? We wouldn't have this, enormous outlay of money that's intended specifically for veterans above, right, what we allocate to sort of anybody else who might be in this system, right? And so I think you're right. So at some point it might look like, oh man, if we had this baseline, it's not going to be much other than expressions of gratitude or apologies, and I think it might, right, so there might be ways that it does, we might sort of start to think about, like, I guess what I mentioned in like thinking about better like legal avenues for redressing certain things that maybe, I don't know, were waived or suspended, at least during wartime. But I think you're right in that I don't actually think when I'm talking in this sort of really minimal level, right, that it's going to exceed far beyond what would be a sort of baseline. Now, I think there are other theories about, so that would apply to certain subclasses of veterans that might say, well, then I'm going to prioritize something for them that might raise it above and beyond whatever this minimal level is. For the purposes of this, right, where I wanted to just sort of apply class-wide, I think that's the most I'm advocating for.
Great, thank you.
Thanks
off.
again, Ashley. Oh, sorry. Thanks again, Ashley, for the really good talk and question and answer period. Give another round of applause. Gregory, did you have slides that you needed to share, or?
I do, yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure if Rachel can make you co-host, so you can share.
I'm sorry. You should be good now.
All right. All right, thank you, everyone. And great presentation, Ashley. This presentation is about the question whether there is a duty to get vaccinated. And I want to focus on the moral question. I don't want to focus on the political question. I don't want to focus on the legality of vaccine mandates. I'm not interested right now, at least, in the science behind the vaccines. And in fact, I'm not wanting just to focus on COVID, the COVID-19 vaccines. I'm interested in vaccines in general. And I want to have an honest conversation. I think that these political debates and the current pandemic that we're experiencing have obscured the moral issue, the moral question. And so I'm not trying to take a hard stand one way or the other on this. And I'm interested in getting your feedback and just testing out some of these ideas with you. I use the language in this presentation of moral obligation. And what I mean is I'm intending to frame it in the strongest way possible. So I'm thinking of it in the sense of a duty, like a Kantian duty. I'm okay if you want, we can go a little weaker with the duties of the prima facie duties of W.D. Ross, if you like, but I still am thinking of, I'm trying to find whether there is, in fact, a strong moral obligation to be vaccinated. So first, let's try to answer this question. Is there a duty to be vaccinated for my own sake? Okay. Personally, it's unclear to me how this could be a duty because a vaccine doesn't prevent you necessarily from death. It doesn't even prevent you, as we're learning, from contracting the virus, right? It's supposed to prevent you from getting sick or really sick. Saying we have a duty seems to be saying that we have a duty to choose only low risk activities and maybe even a lifestyle that avoids risks to self whenever possible. But this seemed odd and severe. So if we do have this duty to ourselves, then there's also a duty not to travel by car, at least for fun, right? Ride on motorcycles, play contact sports, which we might want to debate, but go surfing, eat unhealthy foods, drink alcohol, and even invest in the stock market. These would be things that we shouldn't do if, in fact, there is a duty to get vaccinated for our own sake. But this can't be right, right? So maybe we have a duty to take care of ourselves in general, but it's hard to imagine that this is anything more than a general principle or an imperfect duty, if you will, not a specific duty not to participate in this or that activity. So I think the more interesting question is this one. Is there a duty to get vaccinated for the sake of others? So it seems to me that if there is a duty to get vaccinated, it must be a duty to protect from real harms that could result from one's choices. And this is where I want to bring up drowning child cases. So if you're familiar with these, there's lots of them out there. They're usually talked about in the context of famine relief or something like that. But actually they appear in this literature as well. And so I'm going to spend most of the rest of this presentation applying drowning child cases to the question about vaccines. So you've got Peter Singer in 1972, Wellman in 2014, and many others who talk about child drowning cases. The point is, if you see a child drowning and you are able to save the child without, quote, unreasonable cost to oneself, then you are obligated to do so. That's the gist of the child drowning case. Singer articulates it as, quote, without comparable moral importance. If you don't have anything that measures up, you have an obligation to get vaccinated. Wellman argues that the nationality of the child is irrelevant, the distance from the child is irrelevant, and the fact that the aid is mediated by technology is irrelevant. Applied to the question of famine relief, Wellman thinks that there's a strong moral obligation, at least a modest $100 charitable donation for famine. Singer argues for, quote, reducing ourselves to the level of marginal utility. So it's that much stronger for him. The following article applies a drowning child case, otherwise known as easy rescue cases, to the vaccine question. Just a minute, I need to move this out of the way of my slides. So Alberto Giubilini, Thomas Douglas, Julian Savulesco authored this article, The Moral Obligation to be Vaccinated. And they say being vaccinated is comparable to getting one's clothes muddy in Singer's example. They say there is a collective duty to realize herd immunity. The collective duty, they say, is distributed equally among all individual members of the community on the, quote, basis of fairness, creating an individual moral obligation for each person to get vaccinated. To explain this, they discuss this collective easy rescue. Quote, if a collective could realize herd immunity, then this collective ought to realize herd immunity provided that the collective cost is small and can be distributed in such a way that the cost borne by each individual is also small, so that the collective cost is small under any plausible understanding of collective, and that the collective duty is consistent with an individual duty of easy rescue. And it can be done with a small cost to individuals. So according to these authors, there is no duty to get if it is high cost, meaning if the patient or individuals are immunosuppressed, they're very old or very young. They're not saying that this obligation applies to those people, but it applies to everyone else because it's just a small cost. So I don't know about you, but people I talk to, I'm sure you talk to people about this, who are against vaccinations don't view getting vaccinated as a, quote, small cost, right? Or, quote, an easy rescue, or as a reasonable cost to oneself, or not compromising anything of comparable moral importance, or it being similar to just getting one's clothes muddy, right? So people who are anti-vax or against getting even this COVID vaccine would protest in response to the ideas in this article. Instead, this is something they believe very strongly. This is something that seems to be held with as much tenacity as a religious belief. They make it sound like this is a matter of human rights, the rights to privacy, the right to bodily integrity, even the right to the pursuit of happiness. Are they mistaken? Are they immoral? Are they irrational? Well, let's take a close look at the costs. What are these so-called small costs? The authors of this last article say there's four. Visiting the doctor, which indeed is a small cost in most cases. And number two, receiving an injection. And number three, incurring the very small risk of side effects. And finally, overcoming vaccine reservations. So I think numbers 1 and 2 are indeed small costs, negligible in the scheme of things. 3 and 4, however, I think deserve further examination. So that's what I'm going to do now. Let's look at the side effects. The side effects, they say, this is the authors, the side effects of vaccines are very rare, and the most common of these rare side effects are not very serious. So let's consider some of these side effects. I've just pulled some of these off of this website for the MMR vaccine, for example. Ages 12 to 23 months, 4 out of 10,000 may get febrile seizures. Age 7 or younger, 1 in 3,000 or 4,000 may get febrile seizures. Mild joint pain in 1 in 4 females who were not previously immune to rubella. A bleeding disorder in 1 out of 40,000, usually not life-threatening. Encephalitis, which has a high death rate, but there have only been 3 cases ever reported with the MMR vaccine, and death, very rare, connected with anaphylaxis and severe thrombocytopenia, which I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, but a blood disorder. Also, if you get in a conversation with someone, you'll eventually get on the autism connection, which has been debunked, but some still believe that. So to be fair, we should weigh these with the actual complications of measles itself, right? Here are the risks of getting measles: hospitalization in 1 in 5 cases, pneumonia in 1 in 20 cases, encephalitis 1 in 1,000 cases, and death 1 to 3 in every 1,000 cases. What about COVID-19 vaccine? The Guillain-Barré, if I pronounce that correctly, you can get Guillain-Barré syndrome, 100 cases out of 12.5 million Johnson & Johnson doses. Myocarditis, 12.6 cases per 1 million second doses, and mostly in male young people. And death. I was actually surprised by these figures. 95 cases, 4,176,221 in Korea, and 9,143 deaths out of 414 million doses. And I'm not sure if that last one is worldwide or in the US. So now, to draw the analogy with the drowning child case, imagine rescuing a drowning child comes with the following risk. 1 in 3,000 or 4,000 may get febrile seizures due to something in the water. We're just imagining this, okay? We're trying to draw this connection. Encephalitis, which has a high death rate, but only 3 ever reported in this pond. Myocarditis, 12.6 cases per 1 million rescue attempts. Death, very rare, but connected with anaphylaxis and severe thrombocytopenia due to water quality. I'm just trying to put it in perspective to try to make this connection between these easy rescue cases and the obligation to get vaccinated. So while you may think saving the drowning child is still worth the risk of these side effects, it certainly isn't just a matter of, quote, getting one's clothes muddy, right? So to this point, we've just been talking about the known risks of vaccines. But what about the risk we don't know about? The question of unknown side effects has gotten more attention with COVID-19 vaccines that were, quote, rushed to the public using emergency authorizations. And so I want to bring up the precautionary principle. Now, you may not be familiar with the precautionary principle. It usually comes up in discussions of environmental ethics, especially surrounding the issue of GMOs and the unknown dangers of GMOs. So David Resnick argues that the precautionary principle can inform the decision-making of both patients and providers, but he is careful to distinguish the principle from expected utility theory and, quote, nomological possibility. Expected utility theory is a calculation that is used when we have enough information to assign objective probabilities, even though we can't be certain of the outcome. Nomological possibility is when an event is possible, but we have no reason to believe it will occur. The precautionary principle, on the other hand, applies when we lack conclusive scientific evidence to estimate objective probabilities. So expected utility theory doesn't apply, but the outcome is still plausible. So mere nomological possibilities are ruled out. So Resnick says that it is nomologically possible that my car might just fall apart into a million pieces on the way to work, but it isn't all plausible because we have no experience of such things happening. On the other hand, it is plausible that I could get a flat tire on the way to work, even though I have no reason to believe it will happen today. Since this is plausible, the precautionary principle would advise that I pack a spare and a jack. So the question, I think, with the precautionary principle is whether this is a reasonable principle in other areas, whether it applies here to vaccinations. And if it does, then I think it does have some relevance to deciding whether or not there's a strong moral obligation to get vaccinated. And the precautionary principle would then be in regards to the unknown side effects of vaccines, especially ones like the ones that are rushed out to the public. So that was one of the items from the last article, the side effects, the concern of side effects. The other one is overcoming vaccine reservations. And it's unclear what the authors mean by this. It's just mentioned in passing, and they don't really discuss it. Do they mean they must overcome their religious objections, if they have any? Is this about philosophical objections? But there are these two examples that come to mind here. The first one is the moral objection to using fetal tissue derived from aborted fetuses. And just to be clear, none of the vaccines actually have fetal tissue in them. But Johnson & Johnson, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was created based on information and research done on a tissue line that came from an aborted fetus in 1985. And from what I found is that even the other ones too have some connection to this research. So that's one concern, or one possible reservation. And the other one is something I call crunchy religion, which is the philosophy of life that focuses on natural diets, holistic medicine. It's the practice of avoiding GMOs, artificial additives, and toxic elements in life, right? Y'all know this one? So I have friends like this, right? They don't want to get vaccinated because they don't want to put anything unnatural in their bodies. Is that the type of reservation that they have in mind? That this is just a small cost in their view that they need to overcome in order to meet this obligation. So imagine these reservations, quote reservations, in the drowning child case. Imagine that the only way to rescue the child is to utilize a technology that was derived from human experimentation on non-consenting subjects, or a technology that violates a moral belief you hold strongly. For example, a view you have on human cloning, embryonic stem cell research, animal research, etc. Fill in the blank. While you may think that saving the drowning child is still worth overcoming these reservations, it certainly isn't just a matter of, quote, getting one's clothes muddy, as Singer says. It means violating a deeply held religious view or making a choice that violates your philosophy of life. The authors allow for exceptions for, quote, high costs of a psychological nature or for psychological distress. Perhaps they mean to accommodate religious and philosophical views here. But they say, however, that this doesn't mean that there is no obligation to save or rescue. It just means that, like pacifists in the army, they must find another way to serve. This might be an adequate response and satisfies lots of us, but what is left of the original, quote, duty to vaccinate if there are other ways to serve? It seems that any obligation to get vaccinated disappears and we are left with a vague principle of solidarity. So I just wanted to make two more points and then I'll be done. Focus on the question of whether there is an individual obligation here as opposed to a collective obligation. So if we tie this to the child drowning case, so unlike the drowning child case, there is no identifiable drowning child, right? There is only the likelihood of future victims. Also, the responsibility doesn't rest on you alone. It depends on your cooperation with others so that herd immunity can be reached. In order to make it fit the drowning child scenario, it would be like forming a human chain from the beach to reach someone in danger way offshore. But in this case, there is no one in immediate danger, only statistical persons in the future. So to make it more analogous, we might imagine a large construction project involving many workers needed to make a popular swimming hole safer for visitors. Do the individual workers have an obligation to participate, similar to the obligation to rescue? Finally, is there an obligation to trust? Choosing to get vaccinated involves trusting the medical establishment and society in general. Consider historical cases that have led to increased distrust of medical professionals, such as the case of Henrietta Lacks, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, etc. In the drowning child case, it would be comparable to standing next to someone on the shore who has lied to you in the past, but who tells you now that the only way to rescue that child is to take a pill that they themselves made. Is there an obligation to trust them? And that's all I have. So interested in what thoughts you might have.
Thank you so much for the talk, Gregory. It's always interesting to hear about vaccination issues in the USA when you're from Canada. So as per last time, if you have a question, please use the raise hand feature, and then I'll just go in the order that it appears on my screen. Dave?
Thank you, Gregory. Excellent talk. So one thing I thought about, and maybe I want to suggest that it's actually really hard to separate politics from this discussion, is because I think one of the major psychological costs out here, and by out here I mean Appalachia, where it is very much Trump country, we're about 40% vaccinated, is the social pressure and the politicization of getting vaccinated. So I mean, it probably just adds to your argument, but for some people, you might also be looking at a kind of social ostracization, right? I was the only one wearing a mask in Walmart this morning, for instance, and I could imagine, people, if it was in a social group, there'd be tremendous pressure not to wear that mask. So I'm curious if the political aspect does somehow play into it that way.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that. That does seem to be a cost, right? That has to be overcome if they're going to get vaccinated. Yeah, I mean, I've sensed that myself, not wanting to share with certain people whether I've been vaccinated, right? Just want to keep it, not disclose it. Yeah, that's an interesting. I think they might include that in this category of psychological costs. Thank you. Good point.
Andrew?
Hi, good morning. I'm in California, where I think things are different than Appalachia. So here, I have two questions. One is, I'd like to hear more about that vague principle of solidarity that you just kind of passed over at the end. I actually think that may be an important component here, that that we have an obligation to play along, in a sense. Is there some sense of, like, we're all in it together and we need to participate equally? And then the second question is really sort of about moral theory. Are there really these abstract universal duties, or are the duties dependent on who we are? So I'm thinking like doctors, nurses, cops, soldiers may have more of an obligation to get vaccinated than people that don't encounter the general public, right? So that it could have to do with our role, our vocation, our likelihood to infect others. Is it really just abstract, or is it concrete and located in that sense? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that in response to the first one, can you say the first one more time? I just had an answer.
Well, so solidarity seems important, and
yes.
Maybe there's a need to play along.
Yeah, right. I think I agree with that, but my problem with the authors of this article is that if that's the case, can you pull out a specific obligation to get vaccinated out of that general, or what I call vague obligation, collective obligation? I mean, we do have an obligation to others. And by the way, if you read the abstract for this paper in the handout, then I didn't deliver on my promise in the last line, but I'm still working on that outcome. There does seem to be some kind of obligation here that we should together, all of us, work towards some solution. But as far as a specific obligation to get vaccinated, I'm not sure that comes out of that. With your second example of like first responders and others, there might be an obligation for certain people to get it, right? But then you've introduced so many different specific, exceptions or cases, right? I'm not sure what to do with that. Now, personally, I'm not a big fan of deontological ethics, partly for this reason. There are just so many exceptions, right? And so I think it's so situational. And I just don't know if we can, in this case, I'm just using this as one example now, that the whether to get vaccinated, I just don't think, I don't know. I have my doubts about there being a universal moral obligation to do so. Now, the authors in the article, they do allow for those special cases. They do allow for medical exemptions and things like that. But even beyond that, I see so many other problems with trying to establish some kind of moral obligation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Leonard?
Cheers, Greg. I like the paper. So I guess I want to stand up for the idea that there might be a duty to self to get vaccinated. Maybe that didn't get quite enough of a fair hearing. It might look something like this: a duty not to take unreasonable risks to oneself when one could avoid doing so at low cost or easily, right? So driving a car for fun doesn't seem like an unreasonable risk. The probability of you being harmed by driving, that doesn't seem like it would be unreasonable. I realize that word is doing a lot of work here, but it certainly has some kind of intuitive purchase. I'm not sure what to say about surfing, right? Surfing at Newport Beach on a nice day, probably not an unreasonable risk. Surfing during a hurricane or in shark-infested waters, yeah, unreasonable. So with that in mind, sort of moving to the idea of vaccines, it would depend, right, on the likelihood of the various harms in question. Right, if I could be vaccinated against a very serious disease, which is striking a large percentage of the population and causes a high degree of morbidity and mortality, maybe I really do have a moral duty to myself, right, to get vaccinated there. If it's just the flu, maybe not. Right? There may be other reasons, but that doesn't sound completely crazy. So what am I missing?
Well, so let's use one of the other examples. Okay, cars isn't selling very well, but let's use motorcycles, right? Mm-hmm. So I've got friends who love to ride motorcycles. I don't. Mm-hmm. And so I've often thought, like, to myself, why do you guys take such risks? I mean, they're risky compared to driving in a car, right? And something you could do, I mean, you don't have to ride a motorcycle, you can just get a car, but they choose to because they enjoy it. There's a different level of enjoyment you get, I'm told, out of riding on a motorcycle than you do in riding in a car. And if we were to apply your principle, Leonard, I think we'd have to rule out riding in motorcycles in that case, right? Are you willing to do that? Is that reasonable? I don't know. Yeah. I don't think so.
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't be that sad to say that, right? It may be that you're violating a duty to yourself there, but it doesn't follow, for example, that riding a motorcycle should be illegal, right? That might be.
Oh no,
yeah.
I'm not saying that.
Yeah. So just to make the distinction, right? It may well be not only that riding a motorcycle, but even eating certain kinds of foods is immoral because of the risks that you're taking to yourself. It's taking some of the bite out of that might be the fact that you wouldn't want to be paternalistic about applying these things.
Then also this would apply to the crunchy religion I talked about, right? That type of lifestyle avoids these type of things. And we might say that if there's an obligation to oneself to get vaccinated, then that whole worldview is out.
Yeah.
And that seems problematic to me. I don't know.
Yeah. I know there are other hands up. So I'll just say one thing quickly in response, actually two things quickly. Those of you who don't know, Greg and I are both from California. So the crunchy religion thing hits home in more than one way.
Yeah.
But yeah, maybe it's just because it's early on a Saturday, but I feel like that's actually okay. I'm not so sure they're not violating a moral obligation to themselves by living.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Rachel?
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for your talk, which was very interesting and engaging. I had also two minor questions. And the first is whether you're distinguishing at all between a duty and an obligation, as some people have. And the second is that, as you pointed out, there seems to be a disanalogy between the drowning child case and the vaccine case, because it seems like if you don't intervene in the drowning child case, it's almost certain that the child will drown. But if you don't get vaccinated, there's only an increased chance that some people will fall ill as a result, or a lost chance of not falling ill. And so in response to that, I guess, yeah, my question is like, one could say that a lost chance of not being harmed is a real harm. And some people have made similar arguments about medical negligence. So how would you respond to that kind of point?
Yeah, thanks for the questions. I don't make a distinction between duty and obligation. But as far as I do think there are disanalogies between these two questions, right? The saving the child who's drowning and whether the obligation to get vaccinated. I don't think that means that there's no obligation at all. I don't think that means that there's nothing we can learn from the child drowning cases. The authors of this article go into quite a lot of detail trying to explain how there is a collective obligation for herd immunity, and that collective obligation trickles down, if you will, to the individual. So there is something, and the example I use in the presentation is, well, something like that human chain from the beach. It requires everyone's participation to join links in that chain to reach that drowning person out at sea. And so if one person doesn't participate, then the chain breaks. Herd immunity, if 90% herd immunity or whatever level it is we're talking about isn't maintained, then the chain breaks. And so there is some level of obligation, although it's much diminished compared to the easy rescue case that you described. Thank you.
Thanks.
Do we have any more time?
Yeah, well, we're over time, but if Ashley still wants to ask her question, feel free to do so.
Okay, if you want to take off, I won't be offended. No, so I was just sort of I guess partly in thinking about like duties to others, and part of maybe it was like Andrew's question sort of got me thinking about whether or not our duties like depend in this instance on our position. And I'm just thinking about how we think about duty when it comes to like tort law, for example. So right, like how we're holding people accountable for what they might do, sort of either intentionally or negligently when we're harming other people, and what we can sort of see as being reasonably foreseeable, right? And so it seems like, I don't know, at least in the immunization context, right, we should at least be seeing, right, that if I don't take this sort of precautionary measure, and it's at least it looks to be like the risk of getting immunized is not very strong, right? It should be like reasonably foreseeable to me that not doing so, right, might actually pass on this virus or this pathogen to somebody else, and that that harm's going to occur. So I guess, I don't know, I mean, in some sense, I think there is a disanalogy to the drowning child, right? And that, not seeing it sort of right concretely there, but that there might sort of, be an argument anyway that, yeah, it's not unreasonable to like, foresee that if I don't take this action, somebody will drown or, or die or something like that. So just kind of wondering I don't know if that's, helpful, or you're sort of thinking about it in those terms at all.
Yeah, I think that would, I think you could probably fit it into some sort of prima facie obligation, right? We haven't obligated to get vaccinated, or at least, look out for our neighbors in society. But as a prima facie obligation, it could be overridden by other things. Any of the number of things I listed in the presentation could override it. Maybe we could say that. I don't know, does that kind of answer the question, how you might explain it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, I think so. I guess
I mean, I feel more comfortable just getting out of the language of obligations altogether and moving to being the right kind of person, being a compassionate person, being a careful person, right? That would make me more comfortable with this whole discussion. But I did this for a reason, to try to frame it in the most provocative and strongest way possible. Is there indeed a strong moral obligation to get vaccinated? And that just seems like a hard case to make.
Mhm.
So sorry, I cut off the conversation. But let's give another round of applause to Gregory and Ashley too for their excellent session. And thanks for everyone for all of the questions and conversation. But we are done this session. We can stick around if you want to continue talking, but there's no obligation to stick around.
Thanks so much, Corey, for chairing, and sorry for not seeing your messages. So I hope I didn't make your job harder.
Oh, no, no worries. It all worked out.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks. And it was nice to meet you.
Yes, nice
Thanks,
meeting you
everybody.
both.
Nice to meet you.
All right, see you guys.
Hi, everyone. It's 10:20 Central Time. I am the chair. So yeah, this is, where are we? The land and climate. Our speakers are Colin J. Lewis and Amit Mandal. I apologize if I mispronounce anyone's name. So let's jump in. Is Colin J. Lewis here? Awesome. All right, you can take the floor.
Thank you. So the title of the paper is Harmony in the Land, the Confucian Well-Filled System in Modernity. Contemporary discussions of the ideal political state tend to focus on relationships between members of a given state or between states, members of the state and prevailing institutions or systems, and members in financial wealth. Relatively less addressed are the relationships between members of the state and the land on which the state is based. When the relationships between members of a state and the land are addressed, current scholarship tends to engage them through the lenses of environmental protection or wealth management. What such scholarship often overlooks are the distinctly communal issues associated with land management and the viability of the land as a resource, not merely for wealth generation, but for community harmonization. In what follows, I outline an ancient political practice from China's history, the so-called well-field system, and argue that it was plausibly intended not merely as a means of maintaining sustainable agricultural practices for members of the state, as well as more equitable economic distribution, but also used to engender a sense of community and promote socio-political stability. I further argue that there are valuable lessons to be drawn from the philosophy behind the well-field system, particularly as elaborated by the early Confucian Mengzi, in terms of community building and state sustenance applicable in modernity. So the well-field system of classical Chinese thought is depicted as an important socio-political innovation in land management for an ever-increasing population. Interestingly, even in the context of scholarship on classical Chinese philosophy, history, and culture, relatively little has been written regarding the well-field system. This is possibly because the actual origins and details of the system are somewhat murky, with the well-field system elaborated in detail by only one surviving classical text, named for the early Confucian Mengzi. According to Mengzi, the well-field system was quintessential to a well-governed state, especially in rural areas. He describes the system as follows. For benevolent government, one must begin by establishing boundary lines. If the boundary lines be not correct, divisions of fields will not be properly measured, and the crops available will not be equal. Of the 9 fields, one should be mutually cultivated. Each village should have a division of fields. Each division of fields should be divided into 900 mu, which is roughly 1.5 acres. The center field is the public field. 8 families have a private 100 mu each. Together, they cultivate the public field. It is only after the public field is tended that the people dare to tend to their private fields. In a period of population growth and political expansion, the feudal structure of the realm was dependent on good relations between various regional lords, their fealty to the king, and the well-being of the people. Consequently, socio-political and economic policy were placed on a metaphorical tightrope. A tributary policy was necessary both for the sustenance and expansion of the individual provinces and the realm as a whole. But an overly taxing policy would wear out the resources of the peasantry and damage relations between the regional lords and king. The well-field system was ostensibly developed and deployed by the early kings of the Zhou dynasty to provide just as a means of sustaining and strengthening the state and its citizens. It established a system of taxation that hypothetically should sufficiently supplement the state while enabling the peasantry to provide for themselves. In so doing, the system could facilitate cooperation among the peasants, who did not need to compete for resources, as well as among the feudal lords, who would have been less incentivized to poach resources from their neighbors. Presumably, the Zhou kings and Mengzi regarded this as an equitable and viable solution to a tricky socioeconomic problem. Now, alongside the socioeconomic benefits of the well-field system, Mengzi claims that there are also distinctive socio-political and sociomoral benefits. In particular, Mengzi claims that the well-field system, as part of an overarching program of providing for the people, contributes to general prosociality and positive relations between those partnered in the system. For one, Mungza indicates that given a stable culture and collection of habits, for example, regular working hours, agricultural practices, and socio-political expectations, people will be less inclined to deviate from their routines and their outlooks on life. Mungza notes that, quote, if the people have constant livelihoods, then they will have constant hearts. If they lack constant hearts, then they will become vulnerable to wickedness, extravagance, and then nothing will stop them from reckless self-abandon, end quote. As a geographically structured project, the wellfield system not only allots natural resources that ideally facilitate the feeding of entire communities, but also provides for a consistent day-to-day mode of living that engenders a sense of tranquility. Being at ease both in terms of material resources and an expectation of what the future holds, that is the comfort of knowing one's business in relation to the land that one works, Mungza predicts that people will be less inclined toward anxiety or discord. Being less inclined towards disruption, Mungza thinks it plausible that humans will be more likely to engage primarily or exclusively in ways that are pro-social or pro-moral. At minimum, Mungza asserts the well-field system is conducive to pro-sociality insofar as it removes sources of anti-sociality. More ambitiously, he indicates that by facilitating a routine lifestyle, it will help to foster pro-sociality. Now, perhaps most importantly, Mungza regards the well-field system as helping to establish and maintain good relations among those partnered in the system, peasant and aristocrat alike. The early Confucians do not regard legal statutes and punishments as sufficient for ordering and harmonizing communities. Such ideals can only be achieved if a community is sufficiently morally engaged, and so good human-human relations play an important part in the socio-moral project. If members of the community do not treat one another humanely, with mutual respect, then there may be fractiousness, and fractiousness may snowball into greater forms of dissent and violence. As such, along with working to morally cultivate the community, the ruler should also enact or enforce practices that will foster such positive relations. On the one hand, this process is tied to the aforementioned socioeconomic benefits. Again, humans need to have sufficient sustenance and stability to survive, and the state needs material and human resources to maintain itself. By establishing a more equitable taxation system, the people are given that sustenance and stability, and the state can persevere. But on the other hand, the well-field system creates a relationship of mutual dependence between peasant and landholder. For just as the peasants rely on the landholders for agricultural opportunity, the landholder depends on the peasants for the crops that they harvest. Ideally, this will result in the landholders valuing, at least practically, the important role that the peasants play in their well-being. And so they will act in the interest of the peasants and not merely in their own self-interest. There is then an element of partnership, as opposed to a wholly asymmetrical power dynamic, in the peasant-landholder relationship. Given the fact the landholding aristocrats are themselves also dependent on higher authorities, the further implication is that this ideal of mutual dependence should spread through all involved in the system, meaning that all in the realm, when properly educated, will become aware of the system of mutual dependence and value one another accordingly. Even more basically, Mungza argues that the well-field system can have profound impacts on building good relations on the local level. As he notes, in the fields of the village, those who work the same divided plots exit and enter in mutual friendship. They defend and look out for one another with mutual support, and in severe illness, they mutually protect and sustain one another. Thus, the myriad families become intimate and amiable. Coupled with the aforementioned capacity for engendering prosociality, the well-field system, with its geographical layout and socio-political and economic expectations, is regarded by Mungza as an ideal arrangement for cultivating not only the land, but kindness and camaraderie as well. Much like how co-workers are more likely to establish meaningful relationships with repeated face-to-face interactions and shared activities, Mungza claims that by placing families in close proximity with shared aims and projects, the well-field system is uniquely positioned to forge meaningful and lasting bonds between neighbors. If so, and if friendly neighbors are indeed more satisfying to live with than unfriendly ones, then the well-field system can create not only opportunities for socioeconomic flourishing and enhanced sociopolitical stability, but also raise the quality of life for participating families in less tangible ways as well. Taken together, these features might be thought of as the hidden benefits of the land shared under the well-field system as reported by Mungza. Now, one might question why the well-field system could be thought to have any applicability in modernity, especially in the absence of feudalism. In countries like the US, for example, where socio-political and economic institutions are a far cry from those of Monks's time, bonds between feudal lords are hardly an issue, and agrarian-oriented taxation policies are only a minor facet of debates concerning socioeconomic equity. Furthermore, given the tradition of using tenant farming and sharecropping as means of oppressing and stagnating the social progress of targeted groups, one might be skeptical that the Confucian appeals to such land management techniques can have any positive impact today. Nonetheless, there is utility to the idea that shared management of the land of the state can help to forge bonds that increase prosociality among members of the community while reducing fractiousness. For starters, the thought behind the well-field system pragmatically accounts for the fact that political practices are not merely economically oriented, but also geographically oriented. That is, the modern practice and theory of statecraft necessarily attend to governance over territories delineated on maps and not merely the people or resources residing therein. Consequently, the political project must be concerned not merely with working the land, but working with the land and the people that inhabit it. And this includes working toward the harmonization of human communities via land, or more generally space, management. Territory disputes and the issues associated therewith are evidence enough of this fact. If states can use land as a means of instating violence and divisiveness, then they can also use the land as a means of pacifying and uniting people as well. Consider the problem of hostile architecture. Hostile architecture is inherently divisive in its implementation, and thus can stoke factiousness within a community regardless of its intent. Take the example of gated communities. Although ostensibly developed to provide security and privacy for residents, gated communities can also serve as hotbeds for paranoid groupthink that may drive members of an enclave against already marginalized outsiders. This is not to suggest that private communities are themselves inherently problematic. Indeed, Monks's vision for close-knit agricultural communities in many ways resembles such developments. Rather, the point is that certain sorts of community developments or subdivisions might reinforce social discordance by literally putting up walls between residents. If we are to use the land as a way of enhancing social harmony, we should look to other architectural and design patterns. In place of private and divisive structures, communities might instead develop public shared spaces. Public shared spaces like town squares, parks, gardens, and green spaces in general provide opportunities not only for recreation, but also for interaction among community members and fostering social cohesion. As noted by Wolf and Rosatz, communities with a high level of social cohesion tend to possess a number of benefits. Children and youth in close-knit communities are less likely to participate in health-threatening behaviors such as smoking, drinking, gang involvement, or drug use. Stronger neighborhood social ties provide more available adult guidance and role models for the community's youth. And elderly individuals with strong social connections have lower rates of early mortality, reduced suicide rates, less fear of crime, and better physical health. By enhancing the quantity and quality of interactions between community members, it is plausible that public shared spaces can help to build mutual trust among members, in turn generating greater dispositions towards social reciprocity and project sharing. In addition to the added benefits described above, these features notably align with Monks's description of how participants in a well-field system exit and enter a mutual friendship, defend and look out for one another with mutual support, and in severe illness, mutually protect and sustain one another. Insofar as we can assume that an objective of the state is to provide for the safety and well-being of its citizens, and that social cohesion furthers and is in fact integral to this pursuit, it follows that ensuring the existence of such public shared spaces should be a priority for endeavors in urban planning. Additionally, and closer to the well-field analogy, consider the success of community land trusts. Community land trusts in the US have their origins in the 1960s, during which time civil rights organizers developed them as a means for Black American farmers to own and work land as collective trusts, being unable to individually afford their own plots. In so doing, community land trusts served as cooperative farming projects, enabling economic progress and engendering solidarity and collegiality among members, much like how Monks's idealized well-field communities would have functioned. Over time, the practice of forming CLTs shifted from an agricultural enterprise to a more broadly housing-oriented one, typically serving as community-owned and operated nonprofits that help low-income individuals and families purchase homes. While a CLT maintains ownership of all land in the given territory, individual houses are owned privately, This results in an interesting sharing of rights between homeowners and the trust. For example, homeowners have a right to privacy and use of their structure. The trust can require upkeep of structures and land and set resale formulas as deemed appropriate. Arguably, this rights sharing regarding land use and development promotes a number of individual and communal benefits. So CLTs allow low-income residents to stabilize land tenancy rather than being at constant risk of literally having the land sold out from under them. Community ownership helps build residents' wealth because secure land tenancy enables residents to access better financing, and they enjoy higher resale values. Residents get better financing because community land ownership means the buyer will become a co-op member and therefore will also enjoy secure land tenancy. This makes the property more valuable and makes bank loans to residents less risky, enabling residents to obtain lower interest rate loans. Given the difficulty of home buying in general, and in the US in particular, CLTs thus become a viable and equitable path to home ownership for many. Moreover, in the process of joining a CLT co-op, residents become part of a community that may facilitate pro-social interactions in much the same way as public shared spaces. This falls in line with the Mungsian ideal for the use of land as a means of bringing people together in harmony. In place of the aristocrat landholder, the CLT holds the majority of land rights, but doles out parcels that members of the community can build on, with some constraints, as they so require. In some ways, then, we might think of the CLT as a spiritual successor to the Wellfield system, one focused on housing rather than farming, and compatible in a non-feudal socioeconomic structure. These examples demonstrate how land management can be used to produce pro-social effects with communities, at least at a local scale. Now, I suggest there may be even grander applications for the Wellfield-inspired mentality, insofar as such land management could foster pro-sociality and parity between states. The example I have in mind is the national park system in the US. For one, and rather obviously, national parks produce parity. They are effectively open to visitation by all and are relatively cheap to maintain and operate. As such, national parks pose no inherent barriers to entry, making them an equitable space for visitors to engage with natural resources and one another. Perhaps more importantly, national parks are a great facilitator of pro-sociality. Established in the 1916, the US National Park Service has served as a custodian entity both for designated natural lands and for cultural sites and monuments. As noted in their mission statement, the National Park Service preserves unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. The Park Service cooperates with partners to extend the benefits of natural and cultural resource conservation and outdoor recreation throughout this country and the world. The national parks serve not only as projects in land conservation, but also for transmitting history and culture. In this way, the mission of the National Park Service can be said to be pro-social in nature, as its aims are not merely conservation for conservation's sake, but also advancing human bonds with and understanding of nature, history, and one another. National parks help create pro-social links between geographically distant communities by providing a common space for enjoyment and serendipitous meeting of other members of one's country, and do so in a manner that encourages solidarity and pro-sociality. This is achieved in a variety of ways. For one, the National Park Service is committed to a practice of civic engagement through dynamic conversation, which it describes as a process of, quote, enhancing and maintaining relationships with local communities and other interests, both near and far, in order to encourage stewardship of resources on both sides of park boundaries, end quote. The National Park Service encourages visitors to see themselves as having a communal stake in keeping the park going for the country, and not simply for themselves or their close relations. This mission is extended with the National Park Service Teaching with Historic Places initiative, which aims to engage young people with powerful stories representing America's diverse history, offer connections across time, encouraging empathy for the people who shaped our past. The theme of connection reinforces the idea that the mission of the National Park Service is not simply one of land management, but of bringing people together, both with their shared geography and one another. In this way, national parks are leveraged as a way of neighborhood building, putting people from otherwise disparate communities into more tangible relationships through recognition of shared stakes and lineages of experience. Such aims, in turn, echo Mung's advocacy for shared land management as a means of bringing people together, Just as neighbors can be made more amicable with one another by shared socioeconomic pursuits, so too can they become closer to the realization of and respect for their shared history and geography. In sum, the philosophy behind the well-field system extends beyond a method for ensuring the economic prosperity of rural agrarian neighborhoods. It is more importantly an approach to community building among humans who, without being placed in such circumstances, might never reflect on their shared and familiar circumstances. The well-field system thus produces sociopolitical benefits by encouraging interpersonal cooperation, reducing fractiousness, and recognizing a broad partnership between both humans and the land on which they live. In our current era, where there is all too often temptation to regard ourselves as rugged and isolated individuals, with geography and others more as obstacles than colleagues, this is an all too necessary mentality to cultivate. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that. So let's jump into the Q&A. Does anyone have any questions? You can raise your hand or raise the little hand reaction. Rachel, did you have a question? Or Gail? Okay, hi Gail, go ahead.
Hi, I really appreciate your paper, and I was thinking of so many examples, and some of the examples, contemporary examples I was thinking of, I've seen in Brazil. There's movements, both the farming movements to share land. They often take over abandoned government land and farm it together. And also they have a city version that's directly involved in housing, like you were talking about. And in Honduras, which was, I just gave my own paper on Honduras recently. In Honduras, Father Kearney often organized landless people together to own their land together in cooperatives. And there are still some cooperatives today, oftentimes taking over abandoned land. And part of the idea of doing it as a cooperative is you need help in the original context while you are occupying the land. You know, how are you going to live? So a whole community gets involved in occupying the land, and then they have to farm it. You know, it takes a while for the first crop, etc. But I see these movements happening, for example, in Honduras and Brazil. About in the US, I don't know if things like that are going on, but I do know that, for example, at the PJSA conference, Peace and Justice Studies conference I was just at 2 weeks ago, they talked about a street in Milwaukee, 21st Street, where they're trying to buy up all the abandoned properties and having co-housing. So I wondered if you think of those also as examples of what you're talking about. But it seemed to me that the Confucian example that Mengzi was talking about was having the government actually facilitate these things. Whereas in the examples I just gave, it's the people's impetus, which you need the government to finally reluctantly agree. So they give you the title to the land, but it's not proactive. Like, but we do know our government, we ask them, for example, to make investments in low-income housing. And there is this movement, tiny houses. We have some here in Detroit and other places where people are actually going to own their own tiny house instead of everybody moves into a low-income high-rise. Are those also versions of what you're hoping to see based on this idea of yours?
Thanks, Gail. I think in a lot of ways, yes, right? The idea is that we're utilizing the land as a resource, not merely for the sake of the socioeconomic benefit, but also for, or sorry, not for the economic benefit, but also for the social benefits as well here. And this is, I mean, you mentioned the difference between like private collectives versus government investments in these projects. Yeah, part of what I'm stumping for here is that governments actually do have obligations to invest in and utilize land resources in these ways, insofar as you might think that caring for your citizenry is something that the state, you know, ostensibly should be doing, we might think. Now, if you reject that assumption, right, then I have very little to say to you. It just turns out, right? Although I also have concerns about how you intend to maintain the state if you're not also investing in the well-being of your citizens. So yeah, we have a problem here, right? That being said, even when you do have the collective investment by private individuals, I do think there's a way in which you can talk about this being, like I said, sort of spiritual successor to what we see with the Mengzian vision, right? Because for Mengzi, you're not dealing with the modern state as we're talking about right now, right? You know, the feudal or even pre-feudal China is a far cry from the US. And so in some ways, aristocratic investment like this could be seen as a kind of quasi-government or, again, private collective or patronage system for allotting the land in these ways. And to that extent, you might think that the private collective ends up sort of being better than nothing in that regard, right? You do have people banding together to actually purchase the land, maintain the land, operate the land, and refine the land. That's what CLTs, that's what collective land trusts actually do, is you have collectives of private individuals who don't necessarily have direct government support in their investment, right? Buy up those spaces, and then they effectively operate them, you know, in this almost semi-autonomous manner, right? I do think this is a move we can make as private individuals toward these kinds of beneficial effects, even if you can't get the government, be it local or federal, to engage directly and immediately. So yeah, it's kind of like, it's a process, right? It's a process of sort of like shining light on a problem and how we can address this problem equitably. And in the meantime, these are some things that we might be able to do without, you know, greater government support. But also, thank you for the notes on the Honduras and Brazil as well. I think those are also really excellent cases to make to sort of talk about this sort of expansion and progression. So thank you for that.
Okay, Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Colin, thank you. I don't know if this is a tangent or not, but in the part of your discussion where you're talking about the national parks idea in the United States, you know, there is a critique of the national parks, basically that native peoples were there first. So in order to have those national parks, first those people had to be removed, relocated, their rights were violated, and now we're in a situation where you know, the affluent basically are enjoying lands that were expropriated from folks that, I mean, lived terrible lives on reservations. I mean, you know, you get the idea. Is that a tangent, or are you interested in that worry, or what are your thoughts about that?
I'm interested because this is actually what I've heard before. So I've talked about this concept, these issues before. And while it is a tangent, but it's one that is interesting to me personally, because you're absolutely right. You know, the national park system is not a perfect system. And this is one of the major reasons why it isn't. So one of my thoughts on this is how to handle it is looking pragmatically. It's the way forward in terms of how to utilize these spaces. In some cases, actually, you know, I won't make the argument for it here, but I think, you know, you should just give back the land in a lot of these cases. But barring, you know, actually doing that, one of the moves to make has to do with the socialization and the education components of the way in which the land is managed. It needs to be done so in a respectful and manner that acknowledges actually the history of the space, right? And how it might continue to be utilized or might continue to be exploited in certain ways. So yeah, it's tangential to the project I'm currently working on, but it is an issue that I think does require to be, you know, continually discussed and addressed how we move forward with these issues in these cases. That's about all I have to say about that directly right now, but I do think it's interesting, so thanks for bringing it up.
Yeah, so I mean, part of the educational mission may include, again, now we're talking, you know, 21st century United States, but the education has to include that story of
absolutely
colonialism, right? And I think sometimes that's left out, just to put that on the table.
No, you're absolutely right. It's interesting. I've seen some folks try to handle this in ways that I don't know if it's totally satisfactory, but I do see it as being a step in a somewhat positive direction. So here at UC, here in Colorado Springs, for example, We have a lot of space that's actually was formerly, occupied by, lived on by a variety of Native American communities. And as a result, you do have certain centers. We have the Heller Center here at UCCS, for example, which is focused very much on acknowledging and appreciating and mentioning the residents of the land historically at every single event that is held in that context. Again, acknowledgement, I think, only goes so far, right? I have concerns about acknowledgement as being, one and done, we're off with that. But it is something that can be done to help reinforce the problematic history of the land on which we reside, and then might also help us to better navigate human-human relations going forward. That's my just 2 cents on that to begin with.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any more questions? Okay, so thank you so much for that presentation. And now we're going to move on to Amit Mandal. So I'm restarting my timer. So the floor is all yours, Amit. Oh, your audio's off. There we go.
Thanks for having me. I'll share my screen. Please enable me.
Yeah, I can make you a co-host, and I think that should allow you to share your screen. 1 second.
Yeah,
should work now.
I'm not being able to share my screen. I mean, yeah, I can now. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
So, my name is Amit Mandal. I'm a PhD student at Department of English, University of Delhi, India. Well, today I'll be talking about the impact of climate change on Sundarbans, that is the world's largest mangrove forest, with the help of writings, including fiction and non-fiction by Amitabh Ghosh. I'll be trying to base a sort of ethical outlook and how to deal with the land, people, etc. So I'll start. As you can see that this is the aerial image of Sundarbans. Well, some decades ago, when the climate hysteria that had not yet pervaded the popular imagination of the world then, Sundarbans, the largest mangrove forest, was not even on the list of critical zones. It is to be noted anyway that even before the turn of the climatic shift in our way of thinking, Sundarbans was regarded as a place of transformation as well. It is called a tide country because of its inheritance of a unique tropical geography. It is basically considered a pristine landscape, fostering multiple species of flora and fauna, covering 10,000 square kilometers of area. In an interview with Vescovi, Ghosh admitted that if you were to write 10 books like The Hungry Tide, it would never do justice to the absolute magic of being there at night with the tide changing under the moon and to hear the tiger nearby. As you can see, this is the Royal Bengal tiger, and this is a particularly endemic to the place. It also shelters millions of people scattered around its various islands, though many of them now fear of being climate refugees due to rising sea levels. Surprisingly, in 2010, one disputed island named Newmore Island sinks below waves due to rising sea levels. Inhabitants of these islands were under the mercy of tidal waves as usually since their first settlement on these islands. But in recent times, Anthropocene means nothing but a horror movie title to them. Sheltering millions of people and largest community of tigers found anywhere on the world, Sundarban reached on the edge of climate change. Well, a climate change study by Mahadevi and Vikas notes that approximately 2,000 years ago, Sundarbans measured about 17,000 square kilometers and was home to several species such as Javan rhinoceros, wild buffalo, swamp deer, barking deer, leopards, which due to change in habitat and human-induced pressures have now become locally extinct. Situated in the delta of Ganges and Brahmaputra, in the Bay of Bengal in India and Bangladesh, Sundarbans is an archipelago that hosts the largest estuarine mangrove. It is an unique ecosystem of tidal waterways and islands that is home to a wide variety of plant and animal species, including a large population of wild Bengal tigers. The mangrove forest also acts as a natural barrier to the devastating cyclones that originate in the Bay of Bengal, protecting the mainland area. Alongside harboring endangered species of tigers, it is also home to endangered species of freshwater Gangetic dolphin. As you can see, Sundarban is also home to Asia's last two remaining freshwater dolphin species, that is Ganges river dolphin and Irrawaddy dolphin. Well, it is an unique place on Earth that is at once threatened once by cyclones, floods, tidal waves, lack of fresh water, tigers, crocodiles, and poisonous snakes. Cyclones are very frequent here, but due to this climate change, it has become more frequent. Multiple coming each year. Over the span of just 3 years, the region home to around 5 million people has been hammered by 4 cyclones, to include some cyclone Fani that happened in May 2019, and the same year another cyclone named Bulbul happened. Then cyclone Amphan in May 2020. Then this year another devastating cyclone happened named Yas, which hit the region in the month of May 2021. So these are quite frequent now, adding to the woes of the islanders. Cyclones usually lead to the ingress of seawater, breaching of embankments, engulfing more and more farming lands. Indeed, it is a well-known fact that mangrove forests of the Sundarbans appear and disappear in hours, surprise and disrupt human lifestyles. Well, Ghost tries to convey this sense of transformation and mutability in his novel Hungry Tide through the characters Nirmal and Kanai. Ghost says, the landscape just keeps changing from one day to the other, depending on the tides. This is an aftermath of a cyclone. Well, he says the landscape just keeps changing from one day to the other, depending on the tides. The currents are so powerful as to reshape the islands almost daily. The boundaries between land and water are always mutating, always unpredictable. Here in the tide country, transformation is the rule of life. Rivers stray from week to week and islands are made and unmade in days. The ecological value of the place is unfathomable, considering the landscape being the refuge of various flora and fauna and home to around 5 million people, mostly belonging to lower caste and marginalized people on the inner part of Sundarbans. Well, Amitabh Ghosh has dealt with the idea of Sundarbans as a critical zone, mostly in his 2 novels, Hungry Tide and Gun Island, and his another non-fiction work, Great Derangement. To place Sundarbans on the larger map of climatic shift and to present its wildlife and inhabitants on the brink of erasure due to climate change and rising sea levels, Ghosh has taken recourse to speaking to the audience through images, myths, and stories. Interesting about images is that they capture a significant moment a particular moment frame by frame. Each frame informs us about the significant changes that have happened in lives of people and animals in the tide country. Myths, on the other hand, play a significant role in the lives of the islands of Sundarbans. They reveal a significant relationship that exists between the inhabitants and the mangrove forest. It is the audience not only of the stories that shape the lives of the fishermen and honey collectors, but also how they have evolved in the course of time. Ghosh has highlighted the importance of the myths in all of his novels and writings, because these myths demonstrate how the people view the forest and what sort of unique and sometimes fatal bonding they share with the land and the forest, especially with the tigers. The unique biogeography of the forest and landscape has forced the islanders to create new myths, which sometimes provide hope in their battle for survival in this hostile region. One such recurring myth in his novels and stories is that of the myth of Gloria Bonbibi, that is goddess of the forest. Well, the myth is regarded as an essential myth in the day-to-day lives of inhabitants. Myth of Bonbibi narrates the exploits of Bonbibi, goddess of forest, and her brother, and how they have made this hostile terrain suitable for human existence in the face of tiger god Dokhin Rai, who has an insatiable desire for flesh. It is believed that goddess of forest defeated the tiger god and brought peace to the island. Myth has its basis in the fact that Royal Bengal tigers are notorious for being man-eaters in this region. Hundreds die each year in the jaws of tigers. Forest is essential to livelihood of people, and the people before entering into the forest usually pray to Bonbibi, the goddess of forest, to protect them from tigers. As you can see, goddess of Bonbibi left and her brother Shahjanguli were widely worshipped in Sundarbans by forest workers and the people who enter the forest to collect honey or firewood. They're considered supernatural deities who can protect them from the tiger god Dokhin Rai. Well, in all of his narratives about Sundarbans, Ghosh's treatment of time has been quite circular. He travels back in time sometimes to talk about tiger attacks on people, devastating cyclones and floods. Well, past is significant for him to depict the vicissitudes of life in the tide country. On a linear scale, he wants to pinpoint the fact that life was never easy for the people on these islands. And with the rising sea levels, the transformation has only sped up. Now, rising sea levels and unpredictable weather patterns and frequent cyclones happening each year are engulfing more and more agricultural lands. Inhabitants, for the sake of survival, are forced to enter tiger reserve forest and are getting killed by tigers very often. Furthermore, myths are also great literary tropes for Ghosh to reflect on the idea of temporality, history, presence, and disappearance. They have a special purpose in his text. They remind us of not only the symbiotic bonding of human and non-human environment, but also the transformation of the landscape from its dynamic equilibrium state to a static anthropocentric one. The narrative of his another novel, Gun Island, pivots around one such myth, that is the myth of gun merchant. Well, the myth itself is an amalgamation with another legend found in Bengali culture and folklore. That is the legend of Manasa Devi, goddess of snakes. The gun merchant's legend dates as far back as 17th century, the period of Little Ice Age, when the merchant, afflicted by floods and droughts, lost his fortunes and family and ultimately had to leave the country to recuperate his fortune. What is most interesting is that by the end, Ghosh also convinces the readers that the myth might also be inspired by actual historical events. Regarding the myths around the gun merchant, the protagonist argues that they're not quite gods and nor are they merely saintly mortals. Like the shifting mudflats of Bengal Delta They arise at the conjuncture of many currents. By infusing the idea of myth with reality, Ghosh probably wants to blur the lines between narratives of myth and reality. He stresses on the plausibility of myth of the gun merchant with an actual history, rather than being in the realm of oral myths. The lines between myth and reality, fiction and non-fiction, get blurred throughout this process, positing myths not only as a constitutive part of culture, but also further addressing of culture within the domain of larger myths. Thus, there is a thin line between fiction and reality, and both the spaces are easily traversable. Myth tangibly becomes a part of an empirical and scientific truth in Ghosh. Furthermore, in Guard Island, Ghosh discusses about the nature of circularity and non-recoverability that encompasses the idea of catastrophe. The period following the cyclone Isla that happened in 2009 is a testimony to this phenomenon. This is an aftermath of the cyclone Isla in 2009. Well, Sundarbans as a habitat always seems to be in a conflict with its inhabitants, who live on the edge socially, economically, and politically. The increased poverty in the aftermath of the cyclone Isla maximized the possibilities of women trafficking and large-scale migration to cities like Kolkata for livelihood. There's another recurring theme that happens in all of the Ghosh novels and non-fiction work, that is focus on non-human agency. Well, in Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, Ghosh writes that the land here in Sundarbans is demonstrably alive, that it does not exist solely or even incidentally as a stage for enactment of human history, that it is itself a protagonist, unquote. On the other hand, Ghosh has equipped the non-human world in all of his novels with a vital materialist narrative. As you can see in his use of metaphors like moving forests, moving rivers, etc. In Gun Island, he anthropomorphizes one eider dolphin, so rare in the Gangetic Delta, as Rani, thereby providing her with agentive properties, bringing to the fore Jane Bennett's notion of vibrant matter and Donna Haraway's idea of symbiosis. Well, vitalism here does not come from outside. It emerges from within and between matter. It tries to provide agency to the non-human world to bridge the gap between nature and culture, thereby basing its narrative on the idea of nature-culture continuum. Character Pia and dolphin Rani's friendship in the novel defies, based on the idea of delusion immanence and rhizomatic thinking, all nature-culture, human, non-human, bio-zoe binaries. Ghosh's ethical imperative not only forces us to acknowledge our embodiedness, but also our embeddedness. In the post-human, Rosie Braidotti also argues about the matter being self-organizing and intelligent. By discarding the binary of bio-zoe, she quotes life, capital L, as Zoe, thereby denying the belief in anthropocentrism or species hierarchy. She argues in favor of this ontological turn and notes how, I quote, Zoe-centered egalitarianism is for me the core of post-anthropocentric critical turn. It is a materialist, secular, grounded, and unsentimental response to the opportunistic trans-species commodification of life that is the logic of advanced capitalism, unquote. Another theme that recurs in Ghosh novels and writing, that is man versus nature conflict. Well, Ghosh has presented Sundarbans along with this intricate web of waterways, channels, and tigers, always in a conflict with the inhabitants of the islands. It is to be remembered that many of the inhabitants came to settle here in the first place as refugees from Bangladesh or as dispossessed or displaced people from other parts of India. Even after settlement, they had to battle constantly with tides to protect the farming lands and villages from inundation by building embankments. This is an example of a embankment that is considered a safety of the livelihood, and this is also considered as a guarantor of human life on these islands. Well, in her spell of tiger, Manitas of Sundarbans, Sai Montgomery recounts that in Sundarbans, everyone watches for the tiger, but the tiger, they say, always sees you first. It is a terrifying figure that nowhere in the world humans are so actively hunted out as in Sundarbans. Here's an image of a Royal Bengal tiger on a casual expedition in the village. There is always a sense that someone is trying to kill you. Death comes quite sudden and quick from a tiger in the forest. So many people are killed here that you will sometimes find villages known as tiger widow villages. Unlike tigers all around the world, Royal Bengal tigers here, second largest tiger behind Siberian tiger, are said to be natural man-eaters. Some theories posit that drinking salt water leads to the irritability in the behavior, or some have suggested that as tides wash away their territorial marks or scent, they become more aggressive towards any intruding humans in the forest. In his novel Hungry Tide, we come to know of the fact that one of the characters, Kusum, her father was killed by a tiger when she was a child. Well, ghost narratives explore the avenues of self-reflection on the nature of human condition brought down by this climatic shift, or what he calls a great derangement. His takes also aggravate the feeling of what Graham Albrecht rightly calls solastalgia. That is an emotional and existential distress that is caused by climatic shift. It is noteworthy that in Gananel, he does not limit his narrative within the disappearing mangrove forest of Sundarbans only, but he stretches far beyond to include the wildfires in Los Angeles to the climate refugees in Italy. His purpose is to put more gravitas on the suggestion that the effects of climate change are not local, but it is also global. It is slow, but it is all-encompassing phenomenon. Gun Island imbibes within its narrative both the idea of climatic and the climatic phenomena. All the major characters like Dinanath, PR, Tipu, and their lives get affected and intertwined with each other through their personal memories of catastrophes like floods, droughts, cyclones, etc. To conclude, here's an image of the cyclone that hit the region in May 2021. To conclude, the flexibility and resilience exemplified with the islanders of Sundarbans in these cases occur what Gerald Visioner notes as survivance. Such instances of survivance in the text gendered exquisite chronotopes within the narrative line that are best addressed in the localized context of ecological politics and political ecology. Well, Visioner characterizes survivance as a blend of survival and resistance that often involve either an increased or decreased reliance on non-human energy. The case for indigenous communities in the Sundarbans might often seem to be heavily based on the former trait. However, on a closer inspection, one notices not only the daily erasure and sedimentation of salt and silt, but also the domain of memories and the act of memorializing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. So we have 15 minutes for Q&A. Are there any questions? hold on, I see something in the chat. So Gil's asking, can you please type in the title and name of the author of the novel you are discussing so we can look it up later?
Yeah, I'll type.
Thank you.
So I have a question. Thank you for a really, really great paper on that. One of the things I was really struck by is there's sometimes a tension between telling ecological and environmental stories and stirring people's empathy and call to action, either by really highlighting the plight of the animals in the region and the people in the region. Does one tend to be more compelling, do you think, in the other than the other? And I thought of this especially because tigers and dolphins, it's very different than when you're trying to stir empathy for an owl, for example.
Well, I think it differs from region to region. I mean, if we talk about India, I mean, here tigers or animals are kind of worshipped in Hindu religion. So there's a kind of a bonding between an animal and human being, and these are quite specific to the region. I would say, I mean, to the region and religion, and the myth I talked about, the myth of Born Baby, it also spawned because of the attacks that that started millennia ago, and then the tiger is considered a demon, and it is Born Baby, that is goddess of forest. It is said that if you worship Born Baby, she will rescue you from the tiger attacks. So these myths are, yeah, I mean, this vary from region to region. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you. That was very, very helpful. I think in part it reveals that I have a very Western viewpoint that dichotomizes the relationship between humans and animals in a way that isn't true from what you're describing. So I really appreciate your response. I think it was really, really helpful.
Yeah.
All right. Gail has a question.
Thanks so much for your presentation. As you were talking, and as you mentioned the fact that a lot of the people who live there are maybe from got there more recently because they were displaced from Bangladesh or other parts of India.
Many of them
reminded me of a line from Kant, the idea of universal history with cosmopolitan intent. There he said, well, it's a good thing we have wars. The reason Providence has it is because every corner of our earth should be inhabited, and people leave stress and strife, and then they go to places that they would regularly consider uninhabitable. And so I wondered if you could go into some detail. Was it really the case that prior to these displacements that nobody lived there? Or was there a small community that lived there that was then overwhelmed, perhaps more recently, by people who were displaced from elsewhere? And do you think the goal is to help the people who are there have the safety they need from cyclones so they can continue to be there? Or is the fact that they're there due to, you could say, the hard-heartedness of other parts of India that won't let them come into other places that are more easily habitable? I mean, what do you hope for the people who live there?
Well, if you go back around 100 years ago, many of these islands were not inhabited. They have been inhabited around, as I can remember, 100 years or 200 years ago. And all these people are mostly, if I talk about Indian part of Sundarbans, mostly belong to lower caste people of India. And as you know, lower caste people, they belong to the lowest category in Hindu religion. So they might be affected by droughts or I mean, there may be many factors. They move there in hope of new land, so that they can start a new life without getting oppressed by other people. And what I hope for these people, I mean, as you can see, the recently in 2010 island disappeared, and cyclones have become quite frequent now, and all these people are mainly reliant on fishing, collecting honey, and due to the rising sea levels and the ingress of seawater into their farming lands, they're kind of bound to move to cities for livelihood. And as I'm staying in Delhi now, as Amitabh Ghosh also mentioned, the population of Delhi and surrounding cities filled with people coming from Bengal, Chhattisgarh. These are all poor migrant people, and they're all kind of victims of climate change. And many scientific theories also say that at the end of this century, most of the islands in Sundarbans might go down the waters. So this is quite depressing.
So are you or anyone advocating relocating these communities to a higher land that is less vulnerable? Or are you focusing on how they can stay as long as they can? I just wondered.
Can you please repeat? Can you please repeat? I couldn't get that.
So are you advocating for these communities to be welcomed, or that it's organized for them to move to a more stable land further from the cyclone? Or do you want them to stay where they are because they have some identity with the area and they don't want to be displaced and they just need better embankments?
Well, if you look at the population of India, I mean, it's over 1 billion, and it's totally crowded. So if they move, I mean, it will be really hard for them to get jobs, a good lifestyle. So and even the government, they're not working really well for the well-being of the people. And in around 1970, there happened a massacre on an island. So what happened? Some refugees inhabited an island named Morichapi, and the government said that they're intruders on the island. They're harming the forest, but that is not true, because the people who live on those islands, they live a sustainable life. They live on the forest. I mean, they kind of they don't harm the forest. But in the guise of building a tiger reserve for economical purpose, government tried to overthrow all the people, and in the process, around 100 people were killed. So you can imagine the kind of a plight they're living in.
So we have 5 more minutes left. Are there any other questions? No? Okay, well, thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you, Colin J. Lewis. Both fantastic presenters and interesting work going on. So I think the next session just kind of rolls over into this Zoom link. But thank you all. Have a great weekend.
Thanks so much for your presentation. It's so
Thank you.
interesting.
Thank you. I typed the novels here. I mean, you
Yes,
want to know
I wrote them down. Thanks so much.
yeah, if you want to know more about this, I can share my mail also. Anything.
Well, now that I have the titles, I can probably look them up.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your comments.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. It's I've been to India a few times, and one of the times was close after the tsunami that affected Chennai, etc. And so I realized that that whole coast of the Indian Ocean gets wiped out. There was also a conference on Gandhi I was supposed to go to, and I can't remember the name of the town, but it was on the Indian Ocean, and the whole university was wiped out by another storm or cyclone, and they had to cancel the whole conference, and they sent us photos of the damage of the campus. And so I can just see how it's been an ongoing challenge. As you mentioned, one of those cyclones was 2009. And we're just hearing now, we